All right, well, thank you all for coming. My name is Patrick Cozzi. I'm a software developer at AGI, which is the company that started Cesium, the open source virtual globe project. How many people are software developers here? Just a couple. How many people are maybe like community managers? Cool. And how many people participate in open source communities? Almost everyone. Cool. All right. So usually most of my talks would be technical about dealing with software development. But one thing that I'm really involved with is the Cesium community and trying to grow that community and facilitate and support that community. So today I kind of want to tell the story of how Cesium came to be what I feel to be a pretty vibrant both user and contributor community, and how all of us could apply that to our projects. Both things we've done right and things that we've done well. First, just quick background on Cesium. So it's an open source JavaScript library for doing 3D globes. So here's just a few applications that are built on top of Cesium. So we do things like high resolution terrain imagery, 3D buildings, satellites in space. NORAD tracks Santa. How many people track Santa Christmas Eve? No. I do. A lot of flight stuff as well has been creeping up recently. So just to start with context, one thing is I think building community, certainly for us with Cesium, took several years, right? It didn't. I think sometimes people from the outside look at open source and they go, well, overnight you have this giant community. Cesium has been open source for a little over 4 years, and it was in development about a year before that. So it took some time to really build up that community. And we didn't do a 1.0 for a little over 2 years after it went open source. And we did have a lot of people using it during kind of that beta period, but the 1.0 did kind of help drive some of the excitement. And then we've been open source for over 4 years before we've actually announced a product around that, which we just announced yesterday. So one piece of advice that you hear a lot is that you want to go open source right away and try to get that grassroots effort. And Cesium, was closed source for over a year. So we didn't, it was still pretty grassroots when it came out, but really we had to get even more momentum and more features before we started building kind of that community around it. And here's kind of some of the vitals, maybe we'll call them. And these numbers, I think they're pretty good for a geospatial open source project, but they're not unobtainable, right? So you could look at it and you're just starting a new project right now, or you have something that's young and you want to grow it. Like these, lots of projects could reach these numbers. There's a few things they don't show. So Cesium was started by AGI, and AGI is an aerospace and defense company. So a lot of people in the A&D market are using Cesium, and they're not necessarily the type of industry where they're going to go on GitHub and Star and go on Twitter. So these numbers, maybe don't fully represent the user community, but they give a good estimate. I was hoping that we were going to hit 1,000 forum members before the talk, but it was only 800 when we submitted the abstract a few months ago. So the growth is great. A few trends I want to highlight on this graph here is you'll see with the Cesium 1.0, it did a nice jump in stars, but at the same time, if you look at our number of forum posts, you'll see that also kind of lagged a little behind because more people started using it when you have that 1.0 brand. Next thing, so if you look at like the Jim Collins Good to Great books, one thing they talk about is luck and how luck plays a role in great companies, or even really I think great people or great projects. And they kind of say everyone gets the same number of lucky events, and it's what do you do to capitalize on that luck? So one thing that happened with Cesium was Google Earth, which was a popular 3D globe, had a web plugin, and Google deprecated that plugin because the MP API that it was built on was going away. And when Google announced that deprecation, you can see here, at least on our forum, you have what they'd call kind of hockey stick growth, where we had maybe 300 posts a month, and over a few months it peaked at over 800 posts. That's an incredible amount of traffic for the forum. And then you'll see it you could say it's slowed down, but overall that trend is still up. I'd say we satisfied a lot of the users with tutorials and new features and bug fixes. And then we also notice in the forum that we see dips over the holidays. So right before that Google Earth deprecation, This was in December, so it kind of slowed down in December. And this past December, it also slowed down. May, surprisingly, is also another, well, maybe not surprisingly, but it's also another slow month. I think there's a lot of graduations in May. So I want to show you a few more different charts just to give us a sense of kind of how big the community is and how it's been growing. And then I'm going to shift into just a bunch of actionable tips, based on our experiences. So if you go on GitHub and you look at the Cesium page, it'll say there's 81 contributors. And that means there's been 81 contributors since the project has started, not necessarily 81 active contributors. I'll get to active in a moment. And 29 of the 81 are from AGI, the company who started Cesium. And you'll see back in early 2005, we actually switched over. So red here is number of people from AGI. Orange is number of community contributors, so people who are not employed by AGI. And we actually wound up with more of those about a little over a year ago, which is really exciting. A few things to show here is we were open source for about 7 months before we got our first contribution. So we've been out for 4 years, and it took 7 months before that first one. So it can take some time. Don't expect the first pull request overnight. We also did Google Summer of Code, which is here at GSOC. And that jumps the stats pretty good. I think we had 6 contributions for students that were interested in working on Cesium that summer. It's really good for the stats. Overall, I don't think it had tremendous impact on the project itself, though. Then moving farther down this timeline, you'll see, looking at the AGI contributors, we started a lab inside AGI where we were really going to focus on Cesium. So we had a fair number of people contributing kind of part-time. Then we decided, well, let's take a smaller group and we're going to focus full-time on it. And we're going to hire more people. So you'll see actually the AGIs were flat for a little bit, and then it started to grow pretty significantly, which is cool. The Cesium 1.0 is a nice thing to point out, because what we did when we did the 1.0 was, we said, hey, community, we could really use your help when we do this release, and here's some issues that may be of interest. And you'll see the community kind of jumped. We had maybe 3 or 4 contributors kind of pitched in to help the release, which is great. And then again, you'll see big growth. After, I hate to say the GE deprecation really drove community contributions. I really think the timing is mixed with other things, like just the trend of open data policies and lots of 3D geospatial data that kind of really helped drive that. So that's total number of contributors. But one thing that I think is a much better representation of how active or how big a project is contributors over a month period. So this is like if you go to GitHub and you go to the pulse, and you say, show me a 30-day pulse. And here, blue is the total number of contributors. Let me see if I get my mouse. Red is AGIers. Orange is community, people who are not employed by AGI. A few things to point out. So Google Summer of Code really bumped up the contributors from the community. When we started the lab at AGI, you'll see the AGI contributors actually kind of bottomed out at around 5 people. That was the size of that lab that we started. And then it's jumped back up as we've hired and had other parts of AGI contribute. This big bump recently, I actually looked back. I couldn't fully explain it, although part of it was we work with University of Pennsylvania, and they have an open source software course where they have students contribute to projects. So we had 2 students help us there. The final thing I want to call out in this graph is this past month, you'll see number of AGIers at an all-time high, and then number of community contributors have dropped, right? And please do not look at this and go, well, hey, look, you have a lot of corporate support, and now your community support has dropped off. I would actually argue the opposite. I would say as we get more people full-time focus on Cesium, it actually provides the support that we need to support a growing contributor community. What I would assign this to is simply that the external community contributing, you have no control over their schedule and their deadlines and their funding and anything like that. So it's hard to predict when those contributions will go up or down. So here's kind of a typical month. I ran this data for 2 months, where you'll see, for a month where there's 15 contributors, 9 were from the Cesium team at AGI, 2 were from other parts of AGI. You almost look at that as kind of internal open source, and then 4 were from the community. So I think that's a pretty good, for overall, for an open source project, I think that's a pretty good breakdown where You still have a nice community support, but you have the founding companies still providing significant effort towards it. Okay, so the last graph I'm going to show before kind of we jump into a bunch of tips is for contributor license agreements, or CLAs. And we don't take a pull request without a CLA. So a CLA is an agreement where a contributor says, you know, I am giving you this code under the license of your project, and I'm authorized to give you this code, right? Because if someone opens a pull request, like clearly it looks like they're trying to contribute that code, but what you don't know is it their employer's code, and are they allowed to contribute it, or was it someone else's code? So all contributions to Cesium, we have the contributor has signed a CLA. And there's two types of CLAs. There's corporate CLAs, where a company will sign it for any of their employees, and that's shown in the bottom right here. And then there's individual CLAs, where an individual will sign it for their contributions. And they may be employed and working for the employer while they're doing it, but they would have to have the employer's permission to do that. So at first, these were a pretty big barrier to entry for contributing. And then I think as Cesium kind of became more well-known, it became very easy to get CLAs signed. For big companies, I think we've waited as long as 6 months to have a CLA signed. And then for individuals, we've seen them signed in like an hour. And when someone opens a pull request, if they haven't signed a CLA, we usually very politely comment and say, before we review this, could you please sign the CLA so that you retain your copyright and we have the right to use your code? And people are usually very responsive. There's also a tool, CLA Assist, which will kind of automate that process for you, which I think can be good. I've used that in some projects, but I think also having that human touch is also valuable. One thing I want to point out with these graphs, they're showing number of CLAs submitted per year, separating the corporate and the individual, and they're showing how many of those people who submitted a CLA also submitted code, right? So in 2016, year to date, none of the companies who submitted a CLA have submitted code, but all of the individuals have. So one thing that's important when you look at these numbers is a number of the individuals actually do work for companies. It's a lot of times it's easier for them to get approved for them to sign a CLA than for the whole company, especially depending on the size of the company. The final point I'll make on the CLAs is as your project gets big and popular, I think it's really important that you have this so that when you have big companies or governments using your software, they know where all the code came from. Okay, so now I kind of want to transition and I want to look at just a bunch of tips for what we've done in the Cesium community and what I think everyone can do that helps grow that user and contributor community. Okay, so this is kind of a typical breakdown of a community where at the core you have founders or a steering committee that have been with the project for a long time and made some really influential decisions probably at the start that had dramatic impact. Then you have committers. These are people with commit access to the code. In the case of Cesium, they're expected to do code reviews and monthly releases. And that has become, commit access I think has become less important over the years as GitHub has made things really easy with forking. And then you have a contributor community where they might not have commit access, but they have contributed code or documentation or something to the project. And then you have a user community. And this is not necessarily drawn to scale. The user community is probably much bigger than the contributors. One thing that I did wrong out of the gate was like as soon as we went open source, I just started going all over the place saying, contribute to Cesium, contribute to Cesium. And no one was using Cesium, right? So like people will contribute if they're using it and they see value to them in contributing. So like number one tip to grow your contributor community, grow your user community. Now, Node.js had an interesting problem where their user community grew so big that their contributor community couldn't support it. So their response was to lower the barrier to entry to contribute. But I will say that's a great problem to have. Too many users and not enough contributors. In some ways, I think in Cesium, I think we feel that as well. But that's a great place to be. The other thing too is when we think about contribution for a software project, we should think beyond code. A lot of times we think, well, new features and bug fixes. But tests, they're also code. In fact, in the case of Cesium, we have as many lines of code of tests as we do of engine code. So contributing tests is fantastic. Example code, too, for learning is good. And ecosystem projects. So that might not even be in the main code repo. It may be a converter or a data optimizer or something like that. And we'll still promote that, as part of the Cesium ecosystem. And I think it's a great contribution. Documentation and tutorials, of course. We've gotten a lot of contributions to reference documentation. So someone might be doing a port to Java interfaces or TypeScript interfaces, and they're carefully going through our reference doc, and they'll find a bunch of things they can improve, and they send a pull request, and it's great. The other thing, too, is maybe a little less obvious, is sample data. So Cesium is 3D, and we do 3D models. And it's hard to produce 3D models, so if there's sample 3D models that our users can use for testing or even in their apps, it's a great contribution. And then we have a forum. It's a Google group that's really active, and we love it when the community contributes to that, and even asking questions, but certainly answering questions. Then the final thing that we look at is success stories and evangelism. So if we see people that are building something awesome with Cesium, maybe we see it on Twitter, or on the forum or elsewhere, or GitHub, we'll reach out and say, hey, your work is awesome. We want to show it on the Cesium website. And we usually get very positive responses. In fact, we're backlogged with the number of showcases we can put up. And it's good for everyone, right? Because it's great for Cesium, because it shows all the diverse use cases and the cool things people are building with Cesium. And then it's good for their project, because the Cesium website gets a lot of traffic, and it gives their project exposure. So it's been really successful. So then, motivation, right? Why are people contributing? And this is not, what I have listed here is this is based on my experience with Cesium, why I've seen people contribute. There are other reasons in general why people might contribute to open source, like, because a student wants to learn. But these are things that we've seen in practice. So number one, for a number of us, it's our job. It's an awesome job, and we love it. And AGI is hiring, by the way. For the community contributions, the number one thing we see is a user, they need a feature that the core team hasn't done or doesn't have the time to do right now, or they need a bug fix. And a lot of the features that we see are in new formats. I need to load TMS imagery or just a different type of tiling scheme. And they'll generally contribute it back, even though we use the Apache 2.0 license, which doesn't require it. Because they think it's the right thing to do, or they just don't want the headache of maintaining a separate fork. Like, it used to be, the GPL license was used so that you could make sure you could get contributions back. Now, I think, the industry has realized that maintaining a separate fork makes it really hard to keep up with the baseline. So people want to contribute back just for that. And certainly for projects outside of Cesium, we do the same thing where we don't want to maintain a fork. The other reason we see contributions is for people to optimize their use cases. So, for example, one thing Cesium does is triangulation. It takes a polygon and breaks it up into a bunch of triangles. And we had an algorithm that was like n squared, and then a group contributed an algorithm that was a randomized algorithm, so it was expected n log n. Great performance improvement. The flip side of that is that no one on the core team, I will say, completely understands that algorithm, so it becomes hard to debug, right? So there's kind of trade-offs there. The other thing is someone might submit an optimization, and they make the code really complicated. And then you have to decide, well, is this the right thing for the project or not? So we did have one optimization for drawing a bunch of models that were the same exact model, but you don't want to use a lot of memory for each one individually. And then we got it, and we had to rewrite it, but the contributor was actually okay with that. They're like, I just want this feature. I don't care if you take this code or some other code. But those are things, because when someone opens a pull request, it's kind of like a gift, and you really want to accept the code. Other things we've seen is people that want to do business with us. I've seen pull requests come in, and then there's like a meeting in the office a few days later with the same people. And then some people they want to help the project. Certainly with the Cesium 1.0, we saw that with some documentation help. And then we've done a few of these through these programs like Google Summer of Code. ESA did Summer of Code in Space, and then the course with Penn. And we've had okay results there, but they do require a lot of mentorship to get good results out of. And then a little bit, although I don't know why we don't see more of this, for people who want jobs, right? They do some open source contributions. And I tell my students, I also, separate from Cesium, I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and in my class, I tell my students, like, if you want to work somewhere, like, just start submitting to one of their open source projects, and like, you know, if I'd hire someone in a minute who's been doing a lot of contributions. Also, I have some bonus slides that we're not going to have time to cover today at the end of this slide set, and I go into like very big detail for each one of these, and with specific examples from Cesium if you want to check them out. Okay, so some tips to kind of help support the contribution, and I know we've all heard this before, but I mean the documentation, the contributor documentation is key, and we've spent months, literally months on it, and we try to have, as best as we can, a pretty low barrier to entry. Like when you go to our contributing MD file, which is like the main, how do you get started contributing on GitHub? You know, we say, hey, are you submitting an issue? Here's some tips. Do you want to know what you could work on? Here's some ideas. Or are you opening a pull request? Here's how to make sure your code's in good shape. And then we have guides for everything under the sun, you know, coding style, documentation, testing, how to do code reviews. And this is also great when we hire people. We use this as on-ramping material as well. So yes, it's a lot of work, and a lot of people might not enjoy it. I actually do enjoy it, but you know, it's like a high leverage activity where you do it once and it pays significant dividends for many people. There is a trend that certainly I've heard from the Node community, and I think other projects, where people will accept pull requests even if they don't meet the coding standards or they don't meet the test requirements, and then they'll just fix it up and they'll take the pull requests. And if the person keeps contributing, then they'll start asking, hey, could you start following the coding guidelines? For Cesium, we've done that a little bit in that if there's something minor, like there's a white space or some naming convention, we'll just fix it. I mean, that's less work than asking. But if it's something bigger, like it needs unit tests, we'll generally still ask, hey, could you add unit tests? And we find the contributors to be very receptive of that. Kind of related to documentation is on the transparency here. And this, I think this has become a little, GitHub has almost made this like happen by default. But you know, if you have a public roadmap, the issue tracker, design decisions, you know, I think it helps. One is if you're a small project, it helps you appear as many, right? Which is a really good thing when you're first getting started to kind of show some momentum. And then two, you know, it shows that you are being open. You're not just throwing this code right over the fence. When we first started Cesium, we were internal at AGI, and we were used to sending a lot of emails to us privately. And I probably upset many people. I would always reply, could be public, because I was trying to get traffic on the public mailing list, right, to create that archive and kind of to show that there's a heartbeat there. So if it can be public, you know, it should be public. And then I guess, you know, if you're going to be that transparent, you know, you might ask, well, geez, do you really want your competition to see that? And for Cesium, I mean, I think people have steered clear of Cesium's core competency from a competitive perspective. And being as transparent as we are, I think people see how hard it is, and they're like, well, geez, I don't want to bother. I mean, that's my speculation, but anyway, the competition thing doesn't concern me. I would preference transparency over that. So one thing we started doing because of the Google Summer of Code was people wanted to know, well, where do I start if I want to contribute? So we make a label in GitHub called beginner, or I've seen them also called like, first-time contributor only or something like that. And this is super simple issues. I mean, it could be a typo in documentation. It could be a rename, something small and simple, and then have it pretty well defined, pretty explicit. And people will find these all the time, and they'll contribute, and it's really cool. So something I work on related to Cesium is called GLTF. It's a GL transmission format. It's an open 3D model format from Kronos, and they do a lot of standards for graphics, WebGL, OpenGL, Vulkan, Collada. And one thing I did there was in the GitHub repo for the format, I submitted an issue and said, here's ways you can contribute to GLTF. You know, you could write an exporter, you could write a data converter, you could write tutorials. And if you contribute, you know, comment in this issue and we'll help promote your work. And we have a ton of people doing it. So it's been useful. So in terms of the software itself, you know, like we design for different types of things, right? One thing we could design for is contribution. So when we look at the Cesium source code and where have we gotten community contributions to it. Well, they're in what I would call plug-in points. So it might be a new way to load tiles. I said TMS came from a community contribution. Or a new data source, where a data source is something like KML, GeoJSON, TopoJSON. Or geometry types, where geometries are like boxes and air corridors and cylinders. So those are all things that have well-defined interfaces, and it's simple or simple-ish to make a new class that implements that interface, and it's very well segmented. And those are where we get a lot of the contributions. Where we don't see a lot of contribution is in the core engine. So in the engine that streams the terrain and imagery and does the cache management, we generally wouldn't see a lot of community contribution there. But in the plug-in points, you see a lot. So I think that's, from the start, if you can think about segmenting like that, it really helps your contribution. And certainly I know like Leaflet is super popular and has gotten a lot of community contributions. And they say, like, it's really simple, and we keep it simple, and that's why we're able to get so many contributions. So I think you kind of have momentum when someone opens a pull request. They would like to get that merged, and you want to be prompt. It's hard to be prompt because you probably have so many other things to do. So if you can respond once a day, I think that's okay. Once an hour would be like awesome, but you're probably too busy. But once a day, just to keep that conversation moving and keep that person engaged, I think is a good time period to help keep things help get things merged. The other thing we like to do is when someone contributes, we want to make them a rock star, right? And we'll go on Twitter and we'll thank someone for their first contribution. If it's a major feature, and in the release blog, we'll thank them for it. It doesn't take away any credibility from the core team, and it gives people some spotlight that they deserve. Okay, so on the featured success stories, so we see someone doing something really cool, we'll put it on the Cesium blog, or sometimes the blog and also the website. And so, for example, here, these are all applications that were built on Google Earth and that ported to Cesium. And we show them all off, and we think it was fantastic. Now, one thing that we did to help support this, though, because this doesn't come for free, right, to the Cesium community, is that we had to seed it. So when we saw the Google Earth deprecation, we took what was probably, it was a few different people, but it probably would have amounted to like three or 4 months maybe for one person, where we took a bunch of Google Earth examples and the Monster Milk Truck demo, which is a very popular demo, and we ported it from Google Earth to Cesium, and we showed the code examples. Like, here's an example of a 3D model, here's the Google Earth code, or here's the Cesium code, here's the Google Earth code. And then we did that to kind of help get that community transferred over. And then in return, we did all those showcases. But then what we saw happening was people who were using Cesium now, they would go out and advocate about Cesium. And here's 2 conference talks, one that was at False 4G, that were about moving from Google Earth to Cesium. And that's awesome, right? Because that's incredibly credible when someone outside of the core team is out there advocating for you. So that's it. So it's not code, but it's still a great contribution. A few other tips here. So Cesium releases every month, and it's just the first business day of the month. Whatever features are in master, we release. Reduces schedule pressure, gets new features in users' hands sooner. The other thing that it does that I didn't think about until we've been doing it for a while is it gives us a chance to engage with the community every month. Right? We put it out on Twitter, we put it out on the forum, and then it lets that conversation kind of continue. So it has another really nice value of the continuous releases. For your license, I think our industry as a whole has already passed this, but really use a standard license, right? So if you're a big company or a government, you know that you could use MIT, BSD, Apache. Like, you know what those licenses mean. And if a project creates their own license, someone who's trying to use your software, they're going to be going through hoops trying to get the legal department to read the license to see if they can use it or not. So definitely use one of our available license, and make sure you put it in a license MD file so it shows up in GitHub. I think that GitHub did a study, and there's like a surprisingly large number of repos that don't have a license MD file. Also, know all the licenses for your third-party code. So if you look at the Cesium license MD file, we have licenses for maybe 15 third parties that are in there. And again, big companies that are using Cesium, they'll go through and they want to know all the third-party code and they want to know all their licenses. And if those licenses aren't standard, they'll ask about them. And we've run into that at least once, probably more than once though. Okay, so as I'm going through my bag of tips, so I won't go through all of these, but on Twitter, kind of a few kind of maybe non-obvious things to tweet about that I think are valuable is instead of just tweeting about the monthly releases, also tweet about features that are in progress. I think people love to see kind of these debug screenshots and this work in progress building up to the final result. I think it's a great way to engage the community. We've also tried a little bit to tie together the forum and Twitter community. So if there's an interesting forum post, we try to put it on Twitter to try to generate some more interaction. Sparingly, we'll tweet about lines of code or number of unit tests, although they're probably among the least popular. The team loves, we just reached 100,000 lines of tests, but they're not as popular as we just shipped this big feature. Okay, a few just random tips to round us out here. Start with one public forum. Like, don't have 10 different forums for all. Don't segment it when you first start, because you want to drive all your traffic to one place so you can appear as many very early. And again, minimize the private email. Like I said, could be public earlier. Ask for feedback. So every year we do a forum post about, hey, what do you want to see in Cesium this year? And we get an incredible number of responses. I don't know, the 2016 probably has like 50 responses. I set up Google Alerts. That's like you put in a search term, say like Cesium Globe, and then Google will email you like once a day with new things that pop up on Cesium. And that's a good way to see who's building something cool with Cesium. Then you might reach out to them and say, hey, that work is awesome. Do you want us to showcase it on our website? I think conferences and meetups like this are great, to interact in person. And then on the corporate ownership, one thing that we try to do, and hopefully I've been on point today, is we don't say Cesium by AGI. We'll say Cesium started by AGI, founded by AGI, but even though AGI has contributed the bulk of the code, there's still community contribution that we don't want to discredit. So we try to just say Cesium by AGI. So one thing I thought would be of interest is, well, how much time are we spending trying to build community? And I have a few different things that we do and how long they take here. So Twitter, I think we've probably only put an hour a week into it. I do think with more work we'd get more results. The forum, Hannah is the main person on the forum, and she spends about an hour a day. Now we do have other people chiming in, but for the main person, it's about an hour a day. And then the showcases and editing, that takes a significant amount of work to reach out to people, then to help edit their work and publish it. So that's about 10 hours a week. And if we're writing like technical blog posts, kind of like a series of here's ways to use Cesium, that could be a full-time job. So these things can go up and down. Conferences, I think for me alone, I might spend about 2 months preparing for conferences, attending, following up, and that kind of thing. But I think there's big payoffs for that. I think the challenges here are when we take code, we have to be willing to maintain the code, right? So you want it to be tested. You want to try to understand it as best as you can. And for Cesium, we've done that for the most part, but not everywhere. And then there's kind of this idea where your code is open source, but your time isn't, right? But at the same time, if you don't put some time into it, the community won't be as responsive. So it's a huge challenge to find how much time should we invest in the community versus just heads down coding. A few great things to read here. The top one, producing open source software, and these are all online. This book dramatically influenced the Cesium project. I read it before we started, and I think if I didn't read it, we probably would have done open source completely wrong. But I think that we did it pretty right given that book. Please evaluate this session, whether you liked it or you didn't. And please do this for all sessions. It really helps the committee. And then Cesium has a booth with a really cool arcade machine. Please stop by if you haven't. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks a lot for the talk. So my name is Tyler. I'm with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, and we develop a number of tools around OpenStreetMap that are also open source. And I was curious, towards the end you talked about that kind of corporate control and how much you talk about AGI as the founder. And we think about that as well in terms of a lot of our projects, we've sort of started them and then released them to the wild. And then I'm curious to hear from you who's sort of setting the direction in the roadmap. If you were to release sort of a major new version or something like that, how much is the community contributing versus how much is AGI still setting the direction?
Yeah, so the question is, given the kind of corporate involvement, when you set the roadmap, how much of it is community-driven, how much of it is corporate-driven? So Cesium, we're pretty lucky. I mean, I think we're incredibly lucky in that if you go back and you look at that Cesium in 2016 forum post where we asked the community for their input, and they said, we want things like shadows, we want things like 3D tiles, we want things like vector data on terrain. AGI and the community wanted pretty much the same exact stuff. So we've had really good alignment there. Otherwise, I mean, just generally speaking, it's a hard thing to balance, right? Because you have the corporate involvement where they're paying the salaries and they want the project to go in a certain direction, and then you have the community that you want to support, right? So you want to find a balance. But if those are completely out of whack, I mean, I think you need to evaluate like what's the vision and is it too broad? Other questions? All right, thank you all.